Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Bible and Archaeology podcast. I'm Jordan Jones. Today I'm joined by Dr. Cynthia Shafer-Elliott for a conversation on some of the things around the archaeology of Jericho, one of the names, the stories, the places that a lot of us know, and maybe you've had some arguments about. Cynthia has kindly agreed to take some time today to come and talk with us about exactly what we can know and maybe some of what we can't know from the archaeology of Jericho. So Cynthia, thank you so much for taking the time. It's great to see you. I know it's the beginning of a semester and things get crazy, so I really appreciate you taking the time today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
This is one of those things, as we were talking, before, of like Jericho, it's one of the Sunday school stories. Again, one of those, like with Samson, atrocious stories that becomes a Sunday school story, where it's a mass slaughter event, and yet somehow it's the nice song of Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, and the walls come tumbling down, and we all feel so happy, and you're moving through. But it really is not a great story. I mean, for a lot of people, this is a very bad day who just happened to be living in the wrong place, and we're not going to get into all of the conquest morality and complications and that kind of stuff today. There's a lot to unpack there. But with Jericho, Cynthia, why do you think Jericho is so captivating to people's imaginations? Is there something about this story or anything with Joshua that makes this make sense? Or is it just for whatever reason, this is the one?
It's a good question. I think there's probably a few answers to that. And some of the ones that come to mind for me are, well, one, this shows God's mighty acts, right? Mm-hmm. So you have this, monumental event where God is providing for God's people. And that always is something that people like, of course. And it's a spectacular story too. It's something that's almost, if you were to tell someone about it, it would seem so absurd.
Almost sounds unbelievable.
Almost sounds unbelievable,
Almost.
Right? So there's that aspect to it. And then I also think because if you're reading the Hebrew Bible from Genesis and onwards, when you get to Joshua, you're wanting them to just, okay, you've been wandering in the wilderness for a long time now. Can we just get there already?
We want some action.
Right. And so here they are finally in the land that God promised their ancestors. And they finally made it, and here they are. And there's these, and the way I think maybe some Sunday schools or maybe even Veggie Tales or something like that show the original inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, to be, bad people, to be the enemy, and that you almost get the sense from some of the Sunday school, like when I was a kid, I remember flannel boards,
yes,
stories.
The flannel graph, Sundays, Joshua.
That's right. Yeah. And where they almost portray it as if the Israelites are, in the right because God's on their side, but that the Canaanites are bad and that they need to be, kicked out. And of course, there's that whole morality, ethical questions about a story like this and what kind of values does it, people draw from it and use it as a way to justify their own actions.
Yeah. And I think some of the having to justify things, that is difficult. It's easier to justify it if we can portray them as the baddies. And yes, Joshua and the Israelites, they're good. If you're looking at it from another side, they happen to be there, according to the text. Jericho and the inhabitants of Jericho were there and the Israelites weren't yet. And that's how it's setting up that, yeah, God's on your side. And so what's going to happen, and the total destruction and the mass slaughter that is commanded, divine
genocide.
Command to put everyone to the sword, young and old, all the animals, kill them all.
Right.
But we're okay with that because you're coming in and you need to clean everything out. which depending on what part of the Bible you're reading, they either do or don't do. And the people are all gone. Joshua did everything until we get a little bit later. And it's that long list of, and they failed to remove so-and-so and so-and-so. So
you
the
always
Bible's,
have to keep reading.
Gotta keep moving down. Don't just grab the SparkNotes version, because the Bible's not always in agreement with itself
Right.
on exactly what happens in this. And so Joshua 6 is where we get the story of Jericho. And most people know you have that command. Yep, you're going to take the city, but you're not going to take it by the sword, right? There's this divine intervention. You march around the city, and then the walls come tumbling down. They run into the city. You're supposed to kill everybody. They burn everything down. Don't keep anything for yourself, but the good stuff you can dedicate to the Lord. And so that's our Bible SparkNotes version. The archaeology then comes in, and this is one of those things where if you do a quick Google search or you're looking through on YouTube of like, is there archaeological evidence for Jericho? You'll find things where a lot of people are saying yes, because there is a site that's identified as Jericho. It has had excavations, and walls have been found. Now, there's debates on when those walls date to. Significant debates on when those walls date to. But before we can get into that, can you explain a little bit? Let's say you go out and you dig and you find a wall. What can that prove for us? Because I think sometimes people assume that archaeology, you find something, it can prove something. Are there complications in how people need to be thinking about what exactly can be proven by a find like some walls?
Yes, you do need to be very careful. When biblical archaeology, as it started, was really started by pastors, Christian pastors. A lot of them were, not all. And so for them, it was important to find the places where the biblical events happened and trying to make the Bible, come alive in a way, as far as like the physicality of it. And so I think, their intentions were really good, but we have some in the greater public, that identification of trying to find biblical places and prove the Bible. They haven't really moved away from that, whereas those of us in the field have. And it's not because we're trying to prove or disprove anything. We're just trying to understand ancient Israel and its world, and we want to use every method at our disposal. Archaeology, biblical texts, other ancient Near Eastern texts, all sorts of things. And so we don't really go into the field, at least most of us. I can't say all of us.
There are some, who still keep that Bible and trowel methodology.
Yeah, and that's a little dangerous because, the Bible was written much, much later after the events that they talk about. The documenting of history or historiography, if you will, even from a theological perspective, was very different than it is today. Today we can record things in an instant with our phones, and for them, the documenting of events, whether real or not, or elaborated upon, exaggerated upon, that happens many, many, many years later, centuries, maybe even hundreds of years later. So we have to remember that the people who are writing this down were not eyewitnesses to these events. These are things that happened, much earlier than the people who are writing this down. So, and then we also have to keep in mind the ideology of the writers who are documenting it. What is it that because we all do this. We all have motivation for writing, and we all, consider, whether it's subconsciously or consciously, things to include or exclude. It's like when you're writing a research paper or you're deciding what to post on your social media. I know I'm very particular about what I post and how I post it and what it looks like. And it's the same thing with anybody when they write anything. So we need to keep these things in mind, that our biblical writers are writing from a place of distance. And what are their motivations for writing? And what is it they're trying to communicate besides what we automatically think is the history, if you will? So there's a lot of, cultural context stuff to keep in mind about how they perceive events in history and how everything is related to in the ancient Near East in general, just how everything is related to the relationship with their deities.
Yeah, I think that's one of the points that feels difficult to get across sometimes, just that change in how we are approaching the text and how they are approaching the text.
Yes.
If you sit down to read it, you're coming to it with a set of questions or things you want it to be telling you and assumptions about why and how it's written. And trying to remove ourselves from that is really hard because it's how we engage with things all the time. And their set of questions is different. And it's not being explicit with us all the time. Sometimes there's hints of this is why we're telling you some of these things, but you have to ask questions of it to come to some of that complicates maybe how we're understanding it or how we're approaching it, which can be good, but can also be uncomfortable because you start to ask questions of the text, and things like archaeology can start to ask questions of the text. And I want to return to something you'd said about the eyewitness or not accounting of this, because I know there are, if you go watch some other videos on this, there will be people that argue, well, what should we give preference to? Modern archaeology that's done now and is looking at these things, or the biblical eyewitness that they're describing how things happened. And look, they say the walls fell down and the walls fell down. And they say they ran up and look, the walls fell down and now they could run up. And they say they burnt it. So shouldn't we give preference to the biblical record over what the modern scholarship says about archaeology? How would you answer someone that responds to you and says, well, you can say all you want, but it's just critical scholarship and the Bible is the eyewitness, and that's what I need to give preference to?
But the Bible wasn't an eyewitness. The people who eventually wrote it were not eyewitnesses either. And so we have to remember that a great deal of time and space and history has happened since the time the events are supposed to have happened to when the people actually wrote these things down. Now, that's just the way they did things. It's neither right nor wrong.
Right.
It's not a judgment call. It's more of, hey, we do things drastically different than the ancient people did. And the archaeology is also often incomplete. So we don't have, a perfect, complete picture. We have puzzle pieces of a very large jigsaw puzzle where pieces are missing, many pieces are missing, and we're trying to comprehend and put this puzzle together with a lot of missing pieces. And we do the best with what we have. When we have it. And of course, excavations are still going to keep, as long as we can excavate there, could give us more information. But then also within biblical studies and the way, we adopt new approaches or new technology advances, there's all sorts of things at our disposal. So I wouldn't say, to take just one over the other. I think there's a lot of things to consider with both of them, but I do think they're both important.
I think the puzzle piece description is, especially when talking about Jericho, a great way to try to frame this, because there's been multiple excavations that have happened at Jericho. There's still ongoing research into those dig reports or new publications coming out. And sometimes if people are just trying to track news stories for archaeology, it can feel kind of like those scientific stories where chocolate is good for you and then bad for you and then good for you, because things keep changing, which can lead people to distrust it. But it's because as new stuff comes out, as new methodologies happen, we're able to better understand what has been excavated. And a large name for Jericho in the archaeology of Jericho is Kathleen Kenyon, who led excavations at Jericho in the 1950s. Not the only person to excavate there. Some of their work argues against some excavations that happened
and she's
earlier.
not the first either.
Right. There were excavations earlier in the 30s by John Garstang. There were excavations even earlier by a German excavation team. So there's been multiple attempts to understand this site. And something that's common through them is that some walls were found. That this site, this tell, this ancient city, had been fortified, but it had been, Kathleen Kenyon says, about 16 different phases of walls had been built here, which leads to some confusion because the archaeologist in the 30s found some walls. He was potentially one of those Bible and spade archaeologists and said, I found some walls. The Bible says destruction. These are the late Bronze Age ruins of Jericho when Joshua came through.
It'd be great if we had some graffiti on there that said Joshua was here, but we don't.
They all carved their name into the collapsed mud brick before it burnt down, and they said, yeah, we were here and we did this on this day. But that's not how archaeology works.
No.
Kenyon comes in and says the walls that you found that you're dating to late bronze, she actually dates those ones to the early bronze, and then identifies the last phase of walls as middle bronze, which is not when the biblical narrative is saying Joshua and the Israelites are coming into the land. But
that's part of the problem. We don't. The text doesn't tell us, any dates or anything. And of course, if you think about the Exodus story, it doesn't give us the name of the Pharaoh. So if you're trying to pinpoint when these events occurred, you're gonna have a very difficult time. So a couple of the theories that people base this off of is the early theory when they entered the land is based on one verse in 2 Kings of the Solomon's temple was built 480 years. It was completed 480 years after the Exodus.
A nice round.
Nice,
good sounding number 480. That's
yes. How many sevens is that, or how many 40s is that?
Yeah, don't ask questions of the chronology. It's nice 480, and we come after for the early.
Right, for the early, and then but most others would say, well, if you're thinking about the Merneptah stele and where that's the first extra biblical evidence of the mention of Israel outside the biblical text. And that's, I think, dated from around 1208, 1213. So we know that some sort of group named Israel was in the land that later becomes known as Israel by that point. But that's all we have.
Yeah. And this is some of the puzzle pieces that you're mentioning of how are we trying to understand, how are archaeologists trying to understand. You're reaching for some texts, sometimes your site, some finds outside. And Kenyon argues that the last walls that come from the Middle Bronze Age fall sometime in the 1500s, which whether you're going for that 1400 early or the 1200 late, she says it doesn't really fit either one of those accounts, that it's too old for that, which disagrees with some other people that Garstang wants to date it later. Can you talk a little bit about how Kenyon and other archaeologists are able to come to those dates? Because this is something I think people have a hard time with. Well, why are there disagreements? If you're digging at the same site, how can one person come to a different date than another? How does a site like a tell or the layers of this get dated to such widely different periods of time?
Sure. And I think with Garstang's excavations in the 30s, the concept of pottery chronology hadn't been fully developed maybe even quite started with ancient Israel at that point. So one of the ways we date things is through pottery. And we call that relative dating, because absolute dating, which is what we all would love, is when we have an inscription with maybe somebody's name on it. For instance, if you find a scarab, which is one of those, dung beetles carved into, stone or wood or faience, other, types of material. And on the flat side of it, they put a cartouche of a pharaoh. And that's great when we find those things, but it's also very rare. especially for, early Israel, we don't get that a lot. So we have to look for other ways of determining what is the date, the general date of the layer that we're in. And we do that through relative chronology, which is primarily done through pottery, because pottery evolves. Just like your model of your iPhone. This is the illustration I give to my students is, if I were to put dump a box of every model of iPhone, including the 16, which is supposed to come out like any day, I would put them in the room and I would dump them out, and I ask you to put them in chronological order. You would look for certain things that could be a clue about what order this particular phone would be in. You would look for things like a home button, or how many cameras, or the speed, or how you charge it. So you'd look for all sorts of things that would give you clues as to what order that particular phone would go in. And it's the same with pottery. Pottery evolves over time, and certain pieces of the vessel, in particular, let's say the rim of the vessel, that really evolves and changes over time. And so we use these little, indicative pieces of pottery to help us say, hey, we'll look at the pottery when we're excavating. We'll say, hey, we have a lot of rims from the Iron 2B period, and we have hardly any from later. We've got nothing later, and maybe a few scatterings of things earlier. Well, then we can clearly guess, an educated guess, that we're, in the Iron 2B period. So it's really pottery that's, quite helpful. And of course, architecture style too. That is helpful. But that's also difficult when a lot of the sites we're excavating have been destroyed for any number of reasons and any number of levels that we're excavating. So, a walled city is not, cities would have walls. That's not a unique feature. I mean, earlier it is, but it's not a unique feature. So a city having walls, it's not, oh, these must be the walls of Jericho that fell down, because as you mentioned, there are numerous levels or phases.
There's lots of walls.
These walls, right. So they had walls for a really long time, and Jericho is supposed to be a very old city, but it doesn't seem like Jericho was occupied during the time period that the Israelites are supposed to have entered the land. So that makes conquering it and destroying it when it didn't exist at that time very difficult.
If it doesn't exist, because this is something people ask questions of, well, why would we have a biblical record saying they came in and they conquered this thing if the city doesn't exist, the walls are already down? What other options are there then for understanding how they're shaping this story, either right then when they walk in or later on when this is being retold? How can then people understand how those things come together?
Yeah, well, there could be of a few different reasons why, maybe there was some sort of memory of Jericho being destroyed, and when they saw the city and it being destroyed, later on maybe they just attributed that to their ancestors, because cities get destroyed. They did. That happened regularly. So good for us, the archaeologists, but bad, of course, for them.
Very bad day for them.
Very bad day. And so there's that, maybe they just saw the ruins and they figured, oh, these must be the ruins of the city that, our ancestors destroyed when they entered the land. Because then you get into all that story of, okay, well, how did they enter the land? You've got the biblical story. And then, well, you've got a couple biblical stories about it, really, but, how they settled in the land, and how, they were supposed to, as you read in the beginning of Joshua, that you see this victorious, complete and utter destruction, that they start in the middle of the promised land. They separate, the head of the snake from the tail, they separate the north and the south by conquering the middle first and then going to the north and then going to the south. So but then if you keep reading Joshua, and if you read Judges,
and if
you keep reading the rest of the Hebrew Bible,
yes.
you see that no, it wasn't a complete and utter destruction. In fact, they settled in the land with the original inhabitants and then started worshiping, maybe continued worshiping their deities, the Canaanite deities. And of course, then you see the prophets over and over again trying to say, hey, you're not supposed to be doing that. So even within the biblical text itself, you have competing stories about how this occurred. Multiple voices, multifocality is what we call it. And you can think about too, later in Israel's history, why would a story like this be important? And it would be important to people who have maybe lost their land and, are trying, and I'm thinking of the exile, of course, where they've been taken away. The elite have been taken, the people who are writing these things down, who know how to read and write, the scribes. And they eventually, are looking at stories like this, memories of something like this, that provide hope for them in their current circumstances.
Right.
We're in exile, but yet God has rescued us from exile before. Primarily, you think of the Exodus, and that God has brought us into God's land before, namely Joshua, the beginning of Joshua. And so God will do it again.
Mm-hmm.
So these stories have an importance to them, to the people who were part of that community, in levels that I'm not quite sure we can fully comprehend in today's day.
That there's more at stake in the text than just coming in and describing the destruction of a city. There's that top level reading, if you just skim over it, but the layers, just like the tell, there's multiple layers of reading that come into this, that the more you ask and probe around can start to complicate things, and those disagreements start to show up. Because also we have in Jericho, you're talking about the multivocality throughout all of the Bible. They're supposed to wipe everybody out. Nobody lives except for Rahab and everyone that's in Rahab's house. Why? Well, because she helped us, so we're going to help her.
Because she was a God-fearer, but...
Yeah, and that's why these people are alive and around us today. So even in this little story of complete destruction, we get the immediate caveat of, yeah, but there's a reason why we didn't kill all of them. And yep, they're around us. And these little moments that come in that start to complicate, just in that context, the story of the conquest and the story of the mass genocide that it's describing, that may or may not have really taken place. I want to ask too about the importance of Jericho, kind of returning to that question of, is the conquest narrative, Jericho can be one of these stories that's put forward and sometimes used to prove all of it, because we have an archaeological site that people go, that's Jericho, and there's walls, and they'll argue over the dating, but they'll say, well, there's arguments, but look, see, the Bible described it, and maybe it's not perfect, but we have the site. And then that gets used to look out to the rest of these stories to say, well, but this is one that's said to be burned. The other ones maybe aren't said to be burned, or they're smaller, so we wouldn't expect there to be. And so the absence of material there can't disprove that. Is that over leveraging the disputed finds from Jericho in a way that you could explain to people of how that's misusing the archaeology that we have, and what kinds of things they may need to think about if they're hearing someone say this? Like, what kind of questions you should have about that type of position?
Yeah, I think people are not going to look at the dig reports, and and it's really up to us, and which is why public scholarship like this is so important, because we do look at those dig reports or journal articles about these things. We do keep up on these things. And so it's important for us to take what we have learned and share it with the larger, communities that are interested in this type of thing. Because, this is one of those stories that throughout history people have used to justify their own actions of conquest. And, they can be, I think, without having some conversation about the different interpretations of even the archaeological material, is important for us to consider as far as, geez, is this really what happened? And we won't ever fully know, but the archaeology and the biblical text, this is one of those instances where they do not line up. Mm-hmm. And if you're in this field, that, okay, that's pretty normal for things to not line up.
Right. That's the norm.
That's the norm.
The norm is complicated.
The norm is very complicated, yes. But what isn't communicated to a wider audience, or what we need to do better about communicating, is that that's the norm.
Yeah.
And that within biblical studies, you always need to keep in mind, these texts are not written from someone who was an eyewitness. These are texts that were written probably centuries later that have a certain reason for writing these things down. And that's fascinating in of itself.
Yes.
All right. But the archaeology is showing what a snapshot in time, a literal, the physicality of it, not just a verbal description of it from centuries later. So so a lot of times the archaeology and the text just, they don't line up, and that's okay. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. We're not out there to prove or disprove anything. We're just trying to uncover, both through the text and through archaeology, about ancient Israel. And archaeology is archaeology of destruction. We get the snapshot in time, and then the texts that are written much later. So we kind of have these two different planes, levels, if you will. And sometimes they line up, and a lot of times they don't. And so it's up to us to take these pieces and try to make sense of them.
I think that point of not trying to prove, the archaeologists, when they're out there, hopefully, right, the intention is you're going to go and you're going to excavate, and you will find what you find.
Yeah, if you're you have no idea what's under there.
If you're going out and I'm just going to prove things, that can be a problem. If you're going out and I'm just trying to disprove things, that's a problem.
Right, they're both a problem.
We would love it. The things that people know, they want those named items, those securely dated things, because that's great. That's a great piece, but that's not what's there. And if that's all you're hearing from someone who's portraying a dig report or the excavation, you should ask some questions of what they're giving you or how they went about finding that, because it's not so clear. Because Kenyon says, the walls are destroyed, places them kind of roughly, I think, in that Middle Bronze Age period. But how did they fall? It could be an earthquake. It could have been some natural erosions. It could have been there's some fire. We don't know exactly what led to them falling. And for some, that opens the door of, that is then, if there's an earthquake, that's the divine intervention that brought them down. The archaeology can't tell us one way or the other. What it can say is they fall down earlier than when the Bible may be saying this happened, but the Bible may be saying this happened at different times. It's not clear cut. It's not simple.
No, it's very complicated.
So maybe as you're leaving this, you're like, I've been listening to you and I feel like I'm more confused coming out of this than coming in about the archaeology of Jericho is confusing. Read through some of it. Digging Up Jericho is a great book that you can read through that talks through a wide variety of the time periods of this site, because it was inhabited for a long time, which is a part of what makes it hard to date, because things intrude into later layers, things stay around for a while, multiple phases of destruction. So if you're thinking, I want to get some more information on that, go and read that book. It's a great summary of what's in the dig reports. If you're really feeling like some homework, there's 7 volumes of dig reports you can sift through. If you're looking for a research topic, go off to the races. And if you're hearing people give you the simple answer for Jericho, remember what Cynthia said. It's complicated. There's not an easy answer to this. It's complicated. So thank you, Cynthia, for complicating that for us.
Sorry, it wasn't more helpful.
Well, I think that is extremely helpful. The complicating is helpful because that's the reality. And you're not trying to prove something. You're not trying to disprove something. It's putting all the pieces on the table and saying, you've got to wrestle with this stuff and ask questions. And now that's the job for you, listener. You can wrestle through that and ask those questions. Do your reading, read back over the biblical narrative and see if there are some things that you want to ask questions of, maybe anew after this. But for today, I think that's enough complication. We can always return. There's always more to say about Jericho and all these things. So if you have questions that we didn't address, leave it down in the comments. Send us an email. We're happy to hear from you, and I can return to that on a future date. Cynthia, thank you for taking the time. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. I really appreciate it. But for all of us here at Bible and Archaeology, I'm Jordan Jones. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.